Great, thank you, Lila. And I want to thank everybody for joining today. I'm Ryan Drzwicki. I'm the Director of Clinical Operations, Clinical Services here at Sierra Tucson. And it's a pleasure to be here and a privilege to talk to you guys today. This is a presentation around technology addiction or technology compulsion and all of the different faces, everything that can look like. It's a very, very broad topic, so we'll go over some of the highlights. And yeah, I'd love to. This is an area of passion for me. I primarily work in leadership and administration, but I had a bit of a private practice side hustle and specialized in gaming addiction. So this is an area that's near and dear to my heart. And I really, when I talk about technology addiction or compulsion, I really look at it through an attachment lens. I think that to me, what's most remarkable is the ways in which technology, for better and worse, are dramatically changing the ways that we interact with each other. Case in point, even this webinar, I was initially pretty apprehensive because I've never done a training and not been able to see any of the audience, get a sense of how things are coming across. But once I realized that's exactly what I'm talking about, it made it a whole lot easier. So without any further ado, let's jump in here. First off, and I think we're all familiar with a lot of this. This is the age of the internet. Technology is becoming more and more present in our everyday life and really dramatically changing the way that we do everything, that we connect to each other and that we relate, and what our expectations around social connections are. It strikes me, and I usually get some comments during a presentation like this, that when I was growing up and even through high school, you had a home phone and people called your home phone, and you had an answering machine and they left you a message, and there was a general expectation that that you'd call the person back when you were free and you had free time. Right now, we all have a phone attached to our hip. Any one of you could look up my phone number and text me right now, and there's sort of an expectation that I respond so much more quickly. You can even see if I've read my text, it'll show up as read, and it places a lot of stress and really changes, I think, the way that we relate. There's an expectation that people respond to each other quickly, and sort of this idea that you could judge the value of a friendship by how quickly somebody responds to you. Has it been 2 hours since you gave them a call or text? Then maybe there's maybe they don't like you that much. It's an interesting development there. I think it's wonderful that we're so connected and we're able to utilize that, but it also, I think, pushes a lot of stress and anxiety onto people, and I think it makes it so that we're always connected in a stressful way as well. Obviously, technology is more accessible, portable, interactive, and immersive, and it's that way intentionally. There are a lot of people out there studying how to structure and build predictable and variable payouts into our tech interactions with tech. I worked with a client at one point, and this was even prior to doing a lot of work with gaming addiction, but just a coincidence, I suppose. He worked for, I think he worked for Blizzard during the time when World of Warcraft was picking up, and he was on the team that was really just doing a lot of psychological research into how do we get people playing more, how do we get people interacting more, and how do we set people up to feel like they need to spend more money in order to be successful here. And that was an example for gaming, but I think it's fair to say that technology developers across the board are really asking themselves that question. How do we get people to engage and spend more money? And I think, unfortunately, one of the ways that they do that is through social comparison and leveraging social inequality. You don't need to get the latest iPhone, but Kim Kardashian has it, so we're just saying, you don't need to in the gaming world, you don't need to have the latest and greatest and most updated gear, but your friend's got it and he's doing a little bit better than you. So I think in that way, technology has become not only more addictive, but it's driven or certainly can drive a wedge between people in order to do so. And that's something that is concerning to me as we see how all of this is unfolding. As I mentioned, I mean, technology addiction, technology compulsion is an incredibly broad category. I think of it a lot like chemical addictions, or a lot like eating disorders. There's a lot of different ways that it can manifest, and each is its own unique kind of clinical presentation. But just to touch on a few, scrolling is something that we're talking about a lot right now. I've even seen some articles using the term doom scrolling, which I love. Just refers to, looking through the news or looking through sort of a political website, either, leaning one way or the other, and really getting yourself sort of activated around fear-based messaging. The idea that one side or another is going to cause some major problems, that they're focusing on all the issues in the world and all the things that are going poorly. I think in terms of the social aspect, I think that has a lot of impact on our relatedness to each other. I feel like there's sort of a wedge that's being driven largely politically between people that pretty profoundly impacts some of our social relationships and connections. Just as there's as I was reading about doom scrolling, I was thinking there's also, decided I could call it zombie scrolling, looking through your Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, Reddit, what have you, for just mindless content. I think just disconnecting, sort of emotion regulation through scrolling, if you will. I think it keeps people from being either upregulated or downregulated. It keeps you kind of neutral in that window of tolerance, but also I think wastes a lot of time and takes us away from perhaps interacting meaningfully with others. Social media is obviously quite a phenomenon. It's getting talked about a lot. The impact of Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram is pretty profound, and it just changes the way that we're relating to each other. You're able to present yourself in a certain way, and you see a certain lens of other people, and there's a lot of ability to select what we're showing and not showing, and I think it creates a lot of social pressure as well. We talk a lot about the people whose lives just look so amazing on Instagram. They take a stylized photo of their food every day, and it looks like they're seeing the sunset all the time and just having the very best life, and I think that places a lot of pressure on people. Other areas of challenge, I mean, there's a lot of forum-based content out there, which allows people to interact with others in a different way on an anonymous kind of platform. Something like Reddit or even 4chan or some of those darker corners of the internet really allow people to interact in ways that are different than in the past. You can be anonymous, and I think we see a lot more bullying, a lot more, I guess, a lot less regard for taking into consideration the feelings of the other person. Additional problems as well. I mean, pornography and access to pornography is its own issue as well. I think that the internet also affords opportunities for access to other sort of taboo things as well. You can see a lot of just a lot of material on things that you otherwise wouldn't have been able to see, and that creates its own host of problems. Gaming, of course, was an area of interest and a specialty of mine. Gaming, I think, is a really interesting thing to work with, and there's a lot of diagnostic power just to looking at how are they gaming. I always like to look at the social relationships there. Number one, are they playing a multiplayer game? And if so, what's the nature of their interactions with other people? Is this a competitive game? Is it a cooperative game? Is it sort of a parallel play where there are other people, but you're each doing your own thing? And I also like to ask how they interact with the NPC, the characters in that world, because I think again it's very diagnostic. How is your social relationship within the context of the game? You know, I think gaming, much like everything else on this list, can actually be positive. It can keep people connected, but obviously, you know, when it develops into a problem, there's a lot to be said for just looking through that lens. How do they connect in the video game, and how does that relate to how they maybe connect or fail to connect in life outside of the game? Obviously, gambling as well is sort of has its own set of problems too. And all of these different formats or different issues lead to a lot of different challenges. I think mood and anxiety can skyrocket a bit. A lot of this, and I tend to think most of these technology compulsions serve the function of self-regulation. They help an individual upregulate or downregulate, which is in small doses very healthy and a great thing to do. In large doses, or if this is the only way that people are starting to regulate, then it certainly becomes a problem. And then you see a lot of mood and anxiety issues from there. I think with populations that are struggling with technology, you see patterns with obsessive and perfectionistic thinking. You know, it's easy on the internet to portray yourself in a certain way. You can spend all the time in the world crafting the most, you know, intelligent and wittiest and funniest comments. You can spend as much time as you want composing that perfect text or the world's best tweet. And you can look however you want to look over Instagram. And I think a lot of people then struggle with stepping outside of that, stepping back into a world where it's hard to be perfect. You don't have the time to always portray that. So I see some of those challenges there. I see, just a lot of issues with, I think compulsive self-soothing. I think that technology can reinforce some of those patterns, and that can become really problematic. Along other lines too, it's worth noting, I think there's issues related to having a lot of anonymous platforms. We're seeing a lot of bullying, we're seeing radicalization, we're seeing polarization. We're seeing a lot of people starting to recognize their next door neighbor as an enemy, whereas I don't think that we saw that nearly as much prior to the rise of technology. Big picture, as I said, this is, to me, I just see such profound changes in social relationship patterns, social dynamics, and distortions of traditional social relationships. As I've said a couple times, I don't think it's all bad. I don't think it's all unhealthy. I think that that technology can actually help us to connect in more meaningful ways. And there's some really amazing things that technology allows us to do. But at the other extreme, we see people really struggling with their technology use and really starting to struggle with emotion regulation without those devices. When it comes to terminology and labels, if you know me, I'm not a big fan of labels. There's certainly a lot of room for discussion and debate around, the use of the word addiction versus, internet use disorder, I think was proposed in the DSM versus, I like to use the word compulsion. What do we call this when somebody's struggling with technology? Like I said, I tend to use the terms interchangeably myself. There's a little bit of I suppose, a philosophical debate to be had around each term. Is it appropriate to call this an addiction or not? How does that relate to sort of the disease model of addictions, et cetera? I prefer compulsion, as I said, just because to me, I think a compulsion is a ritualistic method of relieving anxiety in a way that ultimately doesn't relieve, is ineffective in relieving that kind of anxiety. It may have worked at one time, or it may work to a small degree, but it starts to cause more big picture issues than it offers short-term relief. And that's how I tend to describe compulsion, and that's where I think that that's the term that I like to use when people are starting to struggle. with technology. I think of it as a compulsion. This is something you're driven to do, and it's ultimately not helping as much as it is. It's become a ritual, and it's become an empty ritual to some extent. So how do you know if there's a problem? That is a great question. And I think that the standard sort of definitions around addiction and compulsions from the DSM or the ICD-9, I think that those are perfectly good ways to define whether there's a problem or not. Ultimately, I tend to leave it in the hands of the client and the people around the client to define if there's a problem or not. You know, the classic ones: preoccupation, withdrawal tolerance, loss of control. Those are all true in their own right for technology. You know, withdrawal from having your iPhone may not look quite like withdrawal from heroin for most people, but I think that you can actually notice some physiological signs of withdrawal, and certainly a lot of psychological signs of withdrawal. I think loss of other interests is a huge indicator of a problem, or more so than just other interests. Loss of other methods of self-regulation. I think that that's certainly a big sign of a problem. You know, lying about use, and I think some of the big ones are just use for emotional regulation. When people struggle to regulate without using their phone or their gaming system or their computer or their device, that's when I'm starting to get really worried. Outside measurements or benchmarks, including like functional or occupational issues, or impairments in social and family relationships, I think are huge indicators of whether or not there's a problem. For me, when I'm approaching it as well, and this is speaking to the kind of the therapeutic intervention, I like to think about a top-down and a bottom-up approach. I think this goes for you know, working with every addiction. It's just as important to deal with the underlying issues as it is to deal with the actual compulsive use or the addiction itself. And you have to hit it at both angles. You know, I tend to think of addiction, or in this case, you know, technology compulsion, as a symptom of an underlying problem with emotion regulation. But you have to treat both the addiction itself as well as the underlying problem if you really want to be successful long term. On the side of treating the addiction, I think first step is always identifying appropriate use goals. You know, when you're dealing with substance abuse, abstinence is always a good place to start. That may not be feasible. If somebody's addicted to scrolling on their phone, that may be something that's difficult to alleviate. It's going to be hard to take somebody's phone away entirely. So step one is working with the client to identify what does appropriate use look like. One lovely feature too of technology is you have a lot of controls that can help you with that. If you're working with this, both gaming systems and iPhones and a lot of devices these days have some built-in parental controls that you can utilize to help people set limits. If your client says, I feel like it's okay for me to browse Reddit up to an hour a day, you can actually make your phone hold you to that. So there's some great tools to leverage there. Again, on the side of just dealing with the addiction itself, you want to help people understand their triggers. You want to help people plan for relapse prevention. You want to do that behavioral work. You want to help them to write out and understand, you know, when this happens, I feel this way and I want to use this, and here's something I could do instead. Here's an alternate behavior. So that's kind of the direct work that I recommend there. And a lot of that's behavioral. On the other end, I really think, and we've talked about attachment throughout this, I think that the deeper work, the fundamental work, has to do with helping people to work on some of their attachment strategies. We want to help people develop insight into the function of technology use. Like, what is this doing for you? We want to help them understand some of the defensive patterns that they may be utilizing. Avoidance and denial tend to be really big with this particular population, and that's a lot of clinical work right there. It's difficult to help people understand when they're avoiding and denying because of the nature of that particular defense, but helping them to build some awareness of that and develop some alternate strategies is absolutely critical. I find with clients who are struggling with technology addiction, just challenging them to break out of routines and have more novel experiences is a huge behavioral goal, if you will. And then to me, I think what's absolutely critical is cultivating or rekindling a willingness to interface genuinely with others. Because I really think this is absolutely key for people struggling with technology addiction. I think a lot of people fall into it because of an underlying, if we want to call it social anxiety. I think oftentimes an underlying discomfort with other people or issues self-regulating interpersonally in that way can lead to this sort of addiction or compulsion. Or, for other people, it may have just developed. We haven't even talked about COVID and what COVID's done with all of this, but we've spent so much time lately isolating ourselves, being encouraged to isolate ourselves, and I think connection is the key. I think that we have to encourage our clients to connect meaningfully and genuinely with others in order to repair and in order to rebuild the inter and intrapersonal tools and skills appropriate for self-regulation. I think only through building their capacity for social connection are we going to set a good framework to stop utilizing these sort of compulsive means of self-regulation. Just briefly, and I could talk on this for hours, I, to this end, really prefer a relational approach. I think an attachment-informed approach is absolutely critical. I'm a big fan. If you're interested in some of the phenomenological and intersubjective systems approaches, Stolero and Atwood have some great research on this just as a starting point. And a lot of the current research in the attachment paradigm points to some of these relational approaches. I approach a session very much with a here and now lens. I want to talk about what's happening in that session, how the patient is connecting or failing to connect with me, and really just hold up the mirror for that. I think through examining the dynamics of the session really closely and really in depth, we can really profoundly help our clients to learn interpersonal means to self-regulate, to gain some self-awareness. It helps to provide direct feedback to them on how they're coming across and what those relational dynamics are. And I think critically for a lot of people who are struggling with technology compulsions, it just offers opportunities for rupture and repair. And that's where I see a lot of people who fall into addiction particularly struggle with, understanding that a healthy relationship has its moments of great strength and also has moments when there are disagreements, and that then subsequent or following those disagreements, there are opportunities to repair those relationships. I think that is something that a lot of people struggle with, and I think that in doing that and in focusing on that within the context of the clinical session, you can make some really great progress with individuals who are struggling with technology addiction. At the end of the day, and I hope some of you guys are old school gamers and recognize this. This might have been one of my very first video games. It's dangerous to go alone. We're trying to, and I think successful treatment for people struggling with compulsive technology use involves building connections. To me, it involves really focusing on the connection between therapist and client within the context of a session, but also at the same time building their interpersonal repertoire of skills so that they can self-regulate in their relationships with friends and family, and they can learn to utilize that. We are social creatures, and it's critical that we utilize our social tools and our social techniques in order to self-regulate. And again, just to reiterate, I think technology also offers a lot of great opportunities to do this as well. there's a lot of ways that technology can actually keep us connected in ways that we haven't been before. So I don't want to discount that at all. But I think it's critical to know some of the dangers and some of the pitfalls that can come with these sorts of presenting problems. I'm going to switch now and pull up some of the questions here. I see one question. What are your thoughts on getting technology addiction or technology compulsion added to the DSM-5? Absolutely. I think that it's critical that we recognize that this is a real issue, and this is an issue that a lot of people are struggling with. In particular, and I think part of it is just the socio-political ramifications of that. I think insurances should cover services for people who are struggling with this. Certainly, I think the majority of people can benefit from some outpatient counseling in this area, but there are people who are so deeply immersed, and again, I draw on my background in gaming. There are people that are so deeply immersed in gaming that a residential sort of program is appropriate, but you're not going to find a residential or partial hospitalization program out there that's going to be covered by insurance, and I really think it ought to be. I think these are legitimate issues and legitimate problems, and it's essential that we recognize them as such, and that people are able to access the means to be able to treat it. Another question here, just how does this impact children? That's a whole new can of worms, and that's something I was actually talking about the other day and doing a version of this presentation with a group of individuals who work more closely with children and adolescents. I think as much as, or maybe I should just speak for myself, I know in looking at some of these problems and looking at some of my peers, I think, a lot of this is stuff that, can be easy to treat and can be treated at an outpatient level of care and requires, a certain amount of energy and effort. But what they were sharing and what they were saying was it's amazing the degree to which children who have grown up with this sort of connectedness and this sort of technology at their beck and call can really struggle. One of the clinicians was talking about a teenage girl that she was working with who, when her mother asks in a completely reasonable way, like, hey, let's put our phones down and have dinner, she has like physiological withdrawals. She shakes, she cries, she has tantrums. She's 16, and I think we're going to see more and more of this. Kids who literally have really only learned self-regulation or meaningful self-regulation through the use of electronic devices or other kind of compulsive behaviors. And I think as well, COVID really accentuates or aggravates all of that too. I think we're going to continue to see more and more issues with just the use of technology, and hopefully at the same time develop more and more ways that technology can actually be supportive and create connections and solve some of the problems that it's creating. All right. I'll try to go through one more question quickly. We're just about out of time. Somebody was asking thoughts on paranoid distress associated with their technology use. People are hacking my phone or seeing my search history. That's interesting. That's an interesting question. I would want to think on a bit. I do tend to think in terms of some of the classic psychoanalytic way of degrees of symptomology, from neurotic to borderline-ish to psychotic, and I suspect that that this would be somebody whose overuse of technology is problematic in that they're also struggling a bit with reality testing. That speaks to, in my mind, a higher level of pathology, and something that, and that might be a good case of somebody for whom like an outpatient level of care might actually be insufficient. I think that's a great example of somebody who could use some more of a wraparound care, because some of those thoughts are verging on reality testing a little bit. I wouldn't call it psychotic in the modern sense of the word, but it's reality testing, and it's somewhat outside of social norms, social conventions, social understanding. So I also, yeah, I think that's a great question to talk about for a long time, but I think that's a really good case for promoting this at higher levels of care as well as outpatient. All right, well, I want to just thank everybody for attending. It was really great to share this with you guys, and there are some great questions here. I'm sorry for everybody that I didn't get to. Want to remind you that we also have some other great nourishment webinars coming up, so I hope we're able to see you again for some of those as well. Thank you so much, and I hope you have an amazing day.